The risk that comes from inhaling asbestos fibres is dying of cancer. People absolutely have to work in safety.
What we're going to do here is install pumps that will allow us to capture asbestos fibres on the filter, then take the sample to the lab and do an analysis to calculate the exposure. Here we're fine.
With Europe's climate change targets, 35 million buildings are expected to be renovated by 2030, and many workers risk being exposed to asbestos. So how should we reinforce protection against this toxic material, which remains present in many buildings? To increase workers' safety, the European Commission is proposing to reduce tenfold the professional exposure limit to asbestos fibres from current levels. This limit is already in place in France, and I'm here in the Toulouse region to meet professionals from the sector. On this asbestos removal site in the north of Toulouse, Emmanuel, the decontamination manager, explains the many security measures in place.
For workers, there's personal protective equipment and respiratory protection devices. This depends on the level of dust and the risk analysis of the construction site. Then a mobile decontamination unit, fences, a display, some signage and a waste area.
France has a very strict regulatory framework on the means to be used for the protection of workers and the environment on such sites. Dust measurements are systematically carried out.
So there are environmental pumps like this, and there are also measurement pumps for the operators to monitor compliance with the occupational exposure limit.
Inhaled asbestos fibres can cause serious illnesses such as lung cancer, which appear on average 30 years after exposure. Despite the uncertainties, Florian feels protected.
For me, I have no fear concerning my job because we're very, very well supervised. We're the first to know where there's asbestos compared to other trades on traditional construction sites.
In Europe, 4 to 7 million workers could potentially be exposed to asbestos. 97% of them work in construction and 2% in waste management. So what does the European Commission propose to protect these workers? Here's our crash course. Asbestos has been banned in the EU since 2005. However, it continues to kill. An estimated 78% of work-related cancer cases are linked to asbestos. $70,000 people died from asbestos exposure in 2019. Asbestos is still very widespread in Europe's homes and office buildings. The main threat is when it's disturbed during renovation works. So the European Commission is proposing to make the limit for asbestos exposure across the EU 10 times lower. The threshold would drop from 0.1 fibres per cubic centimetre to 0.01 fibres per cubic centimetre. The Commission also aims to support asbestos victims, protect building site workers, and ensure asbestos is safely disposed of. We're heading south of Toulouse. In this risk management company, I join Olivier, its director, at the Asbestos Training Center. Here they teach how to handle protective and decontamination equipment. The company also analyzes samples taken on construction sites to check asbestos levels.
It requires a lot of technical know-how, very specific high-performance equipment. In France, we've had 10 years of experience of this level that's going to be adopted within the European Union. It took a long time to get to that level. To get lower, it will take more time, new technologies.
In France, asbestos is responsible for 3,000 to 4,000 cases of work-related disease each year. Training is mandatory for all construction trades, and yet some professionals aren't aware.
Training is fundamental. Without training, you can't protect yourself from asbestos. It makes workers aware of the risks. There are automatisms to have to protect oneself. They're acquired through recurring training.
Katya has been an asbestos technical supervisor for 1 year and is updating her training. She practices the gestures that will allow her to manage construction site risk.
We've a real responsibility to keep people safe, and it's important to be able to use all means available. And there are a lot of things that exist, but also to be sure they're respected on the site.
The update of the Asbestos at Work directive proposed by the European Commission to better protect workers is accompanied by existing European funds. But are these measures sufficient to address this major public health issue? In Bilbao, I put the question to William Coburn, Interim Director of the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work.
Today, we're seeing the deaths related to exposures that took place in the 80s and 90s. When we renovate or we carry out construction works, we risk exposing workers again to asbestos. So what we need are good procedures in place. We need to have the strong legislation that has been proposed with good technical measures recommended in there.
How about the proposal from the European Commission to lower the exposure limit of asbestos fibers?
Asbestos fibers are carcinogenic, and as such there is no totally safe level of exposure. The more fibers are breathed in, the greater the risk of developing an illness. The legislation actually obliges employers to reduce the level of exposure to the lowest possible technical level. So the exposure limit is not an acceptable limit. It is actually an upper threshold. By putting in place a limit that is 10 times stricter, we should anticipate quite increased levels of protection for European workers, but that needs to go together with awareness raising, with guidance and tools, and with proper procedures and strategies.
Many trade unions think that the exposure limit should be 100 times lower to effectively protect the workers.
Well, this is a difficult issue and one that the Commission has addressed through quite extensive studies. At some point you're approaching the background limit. Here we are in Bilbao, we'll be breathing in asbestos fibers at a very low concentration. So really you have to find a practical limit.
What would be the cost of implementing these measures?
The study estimates that these costs are not so great and mostly will be able to be passed on to customers. There will, of course, be some costs for the governments, as they will have to train inspection services, put in place new laboratory facilities for detecting these lower levels. But all of these costs really pale into insignificance when we compare it to the savings for society from the reduction in lost productivity, in treatment and hospitalization costs, in compensation payments, and maybe most important of all, the cost in human suffering that we're seeing.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
For this new limit to be compulsory across Europe, the Parliament and the Council of the European Union will have to reach an agreement to help better protect workers against cancer.